ID.
Greetings, friends. Thank you for joining us today for our Lake Erie yearly meeting interest group session. This month, we're focusing on environmental concerns, and we have a guest presenter. Mary, would you tell us some more about our speaker today?
I am happy to present to you Mike Ferner, a longtime activist in Toledo, Ohio, and other parts of the world. We won't go into those, but he has remained active in Veterans for Peace. He has herded together a number of, like herding cats, interested people around the issue of Lake Erie, and has coordinated with some other folks this advocacy group that has worked very hard to get public officials to pay attention to what is happening in Lake Erie. He remains steadfast in his commitment to this, even in the face of obstruction and obfuscation and other unpleasant things that come from government officials. And he's really ready, I think, to begin civil disobedience if they don't start paying attention. So without further ado, unless Mike wants to say something else about himself, this is the enthusiastic and wonderful leader, Mike Ferner.
Well, thank you, Mary. And boy, we need to get more friends involved with Lake Erie advocates, because I've been talking about civil disobedience for a while. And I get a bunch of blank stares usually, but who knows? Maybe at some point that'll become more of an option. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and Mary, and thank you, Bill, for taking care of the technical stuff. And I guess we might as well just get started with the presentation. And if you have questions, jump in and ask them. If you're asking something that's going to be covered further in the slideshow, I'll just mention that. But if you have questions about something, particularly if something isn't clear as we're going along, just let me know. And how much time do we have for this?
We've set aside till 3:30, but that would be at the far end. So,
all right.
Would you like to see the website first, or do you want to go to your slides?
Well, let's take a look at the website just to at least show people the billboards. Must have been May or June. You can see the small versions of the billboards going by. Band Factory Farms, Toledo's green water starts here. Water bills high, here's why. Stop poisoning Lake Erie, Band Factory Farms. And my favorite, Lake Erie is not a toilet. And who voted for this? Right below that, there are some of us, we're really fortunate to have a wonderful designer. Actually, this woman lives in Woodstock, New York, and she works for the Institute of Fashion Technology in Manhattan in New York City. And she is a graphic designer for this place, so she really knows her stuff. And I presumed upon her to make these various designs for our billboards. I picked the photos out and came up with the copy and stuff, but she did the design. And then we had them made into these big banners that you can see right below the slider. And we've already used them in one big event here, or two big events here in Toledo, at the Labor Day Parade. And then we had what's called the Solheim golf tournament, an international golf tournament, women's golf. And 150,000 people came to Toledo from all over the world. And we were out there. We had a plane flying the banner over the opening ceremony downtown. So anyway, in May, when I first brought up the idea of doing a billboard campaign, I pulled the number out of the air and I said, well, you know, $8,000 or $10,000 maybe. And then we had never raised that much money for anything. And turns out that we wound up raising $17,000. And this was the first time that we included a equal focus on the animals. Up until now, we had been dealing with the environmental impact of these factory farms on the lake, which is huge. But we didn't want to get into the business of talking about the humane or inhumane conditions for the animals, because we figured out people get sidetracked on, oh, don't tell me what to eat sort of thing. But long story short, eventually after 5 years of doing this, we decided that we need to bring the animals in. And I think that was really a big part of the reason why we were able to raise that much money in a pretty short period of time. So those billboards ran all over Toledo for 3 months. We had another billboard in Cleveland on East Chester Avenue and East 59th, a huge one, and another one near Parma on I-480, and another one on 275 North, just if you're driving from Toledo, just before the exit for the Detroit airport. And we had 2 in Columbus. So we were able to really get the message out as best we could, as much as a billboard's going to do it. So that was that campaign, which just ended the end of September. Okay, the third battle for Lake Erie, that's what we're calling our presentation here. And the next one, you can see the first battle for Lake Erie. If we move up one.
Just a moment. Suddenly I'm not able to advance.
I can do that, Bill.
Sorry about this.
Okay, first battle for Lake Erie being during the War of 1812. Oliver Hazard Perry, which you know, around here is a big deal. The second battle for Lake Erie was in the 50s and 60s. Some of you may well recall Lake Erie was considered dead or dying at least. The Cuyahoga River was regularly catching fire, and enough citizen outrage was generated in the modern environmental movement. Lake Erie was a poster child, and legislation got passed through Congress that even Richard Nixon had to sign. The Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, which have since, you know, become shadows of their former selves. But at the time, it was a big deal and really went a long way to clean up Lake Erie. But now we're in the third battle for Lake Erie on the next slide. And the big problems in the 50s and 60s and early 70s was industrial pollution, phosphorus in the detergents, and sewage treatment plants. And the Clean Water Act was able to do a lot to reduce all of those sources. So the third battle for Lake Erie, however, has now got its own sources of pollution, which our group focuses on the waste from the factory farms, in quote, or CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. And this top picture is a couple of drain. They used to be tile, now they're plastic, but anyway, subsurface drainage. And that's manure that's been applied to the surface and has come out through the drain tiles. That poor catfish grasping for air was taken by a blade photographer in my front yard. I live right on the lake. And a couple of years ago, the algae was so bad, it went all the way upriver into downtown, and they came out and took some pictures of it. And that's our current poster child. So next one. This is our motto, clean water is a right. And I put this slide together purposely to have people on the outside and the seagull right in the middle, because it's not just a right for us human beings. Thousands of species depend on the lake being healthy, and not just us for drinking water. Next one. Just to quickly take a a quick walk through all of the water on Earth. How's that? If you took all of the water on Earth and put it into 100 representative glasses, 97 of those glasses would be salt water. And down the bottom right-hand corner, you can see where there are 3 glasses of fresh water, but only 1 glass of usable fresh water. The other 2 are tied up, temporarily at least, tied up in the ice caps and in permafrost. But the 1 usable glass of fresh water is divided roughly in half between surface water and groundwater. Next slide. And so there's all of Earth's usable fresh water out of 100 glasses is 1 glass, roughly divided into half between surface and groundwater. Next one, you can see where the fresh surface water is, that half a glass, that's fresh surface water. Lake Baikal in Russia, the 5 Great Lakes, and all the other lakes and streams on Earth, the Nile River and, Lake Victoria and all of them are the other 60%. And I did the math on this, took me a half a day, but out of 100 glasses, Lake Erie's share, not just the Great Lakes, but just Lake Erie's share of the Earth's usable fresh water, if all of the world's water was in 100 glasses, would be 19 drops. That's Lake Erie's share of the world's water if it was all in 100 glasses. And so unfortunately, the next slide shows you what we're doing with it. And this is a rather iconic picture from the August day in 2014 when it was discovered that the microcystin levels from the algal blooms was so bad that the city had to tell everybody for 3 days, don't use the water. The next one. So Lake Erie's 19 drops are home to more than 1,500 species of plants and animals. I'm sure people in the Friends are well aware of a lot of this environmental information. And as far as the lake being a migratory bird route, 13 million people rely on it for drinking water. Okay, next one. But 7 years after our 2014 water crisis, some people are still trying to locate the problem. And this poor soul probably isn't going to find the source of the problem where he or she is looking, but they might want to try looking at the next slide, which is 800 plus factory farms, in quote, in the Western Lake Erie watershed. And these facilities, the animals in them excrete, obviously, a whole lot of feces and urine. And we used to measure the comparable impact just by the amount of the manure, but we decided we would use the phosphorus that is excreted by these animals for a comparable to human population. And what these animals in these 800 plus facilities emit or excrete is equal to the sewage from all the people in Ohio, Indiana, Chicago, and Atlanta. And there's some photos of what's going on there. Okay, the numbers of these operations are exploding. And here you can see on the left 2005, and on the right another map that shows you from 2005 to 2018. And the red dots are the ones that have been added since then. The animals have increased from in 2005 from 9 to 20 million, and our group has done some further research, and we think that there are almost 25 million of these animals. These facilities are responsible for almost 70% of the phosphorus going into Western Lake Erie. At the same time that the phosphorus usage, the phosphorus input into the lake from commercial fertilizer has gone down significantly. I'm still trying to get the Ohio Department of Agriculture numbers sifted to find out how much it's gone down, but it has definitely gone down. And this study was done by, you can see on the bottom there, Environmental Working Group and Environmental Law and Policy Center. This is one slide in their presentation. They have a lot more information if you want to go to either of those sources and look up this report. Okay, next one. This is something that I didn't know about until I started getting into this work. I grew up in the country west of Toledo, and as a kid worked on farms, and we used to put in actual tile, drainage tile in the fields. It would be a trench dug. And I knew about this, but I had no idea how significant this was. And in the white oval there that the red arrow was pointing to, that's basically our watershed. And that's basically where the Great Black Swamp was. And you can see that it's almost all of it is in red, which means it's got the highest concentration of underground drainage of really anywhere in the country. So that is a huge consideration when you're talking about what's going on with Lake Erie. You've got Lake Erie in a situation where it's the shallowest, it's the warmest, it's the most southerly, it's got the highest concentration of drain tile, so it's a perfect storm for a toxic lake. Next one. No person or corporation has a right to impair our water, but what's happening with the factory farm industry, the same thing that every industry has done: steel, chemicals, coal, paper, you name it. They try to shift their costs of doing business onto the public, and they get away with it for a while until people rise up and demand that they quit destroying the environment. And that's what's happening with this industry. They're shifting their costs. Toledo water customers are paying at least, and I'm sure it's more than this, but a few years ago, they estimated an additional $6 million per year in just in the chemicals to treat the drinking water since the 2014 water emergency, plus a $500 million upgrade of the water treatment plant, some of which needed to be done anyway, but most of which was done, recently completed, to try to stave off another shutdown in case there's another bad algal bloom. And $50 million for an ozonation unit, which we'll get into later. And this is the latest craziness. They're seriously looking at a 1 billion gallon reservoir that will hold 20 days worth of water in case the water gets shut off again. And it would cost about $100 million to build that, a reservoir. And we're sitting on a Great Lake. I mean, that's about as crazy as you can get. So next one. It belongs to everybody, but it's not healthy. And there's, what probably most of you know about what happened in 2014. And the harmful algal blooms that we refer to actually is not algae. It looks like algae, so that's why it gets called that, but it's actually bacteria. It's cyanobacteria. And it's the cyanobacteria that releases the toxin microcystin when the bacteria is stressed or when it dies. Next one. In this case, green is not good. We have an overabundance of nutrients, primarily dissolved reactive phosphorus, and this is a key difference to say that it's either dissolved phosphorus or reactive phosphorus. We'll get to that in a minute. This feeds the microcystis bacteria that creates the microcystin toxins. And 88–89% of the excess nutrients going into the Western Lake Erie Basin are from agriculture. And about half of that comes in through the subsurface drainage. So to give you an idea of where this stuff's coming from. These facilities put our health at risk. We're talking so far about water contamination, but also air contamination, where out at at these facilities, the ammonia, the methane, the hydrogen sulfide, I mean, this stuff actually kills people if they get into a situation where they are supposed to have respirators or oxygen tanks and they don't. It has killed people. The more manure equals more phosphorus, more microcystis, and also something that's called BMAA, beta-methylamino L-alanine. That some scientists, and this is somewhat controversial, but some scientists are linking this that comes from microcystin. They're linking this to neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and Parkinson's. So microcystin, we do know, is a liver toxin, among other things, and it causes nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and even death in high enough doses. So somebody have a comment or question? Okay. So here's, how toxic is this stuff? And here's a chart that was put together by the Ohio State University Stone Lab, which does a lot of research on Lake Erie. And they had a slideshow I pulled this from. And this will give you an idea compared to other nasty stuff where microcystin is at. Next one. So we can treat the water to make it drinkable, but as we already saw, that costs a lot of money, and that's one of the reasons our water rates have gone through the roof here. Toledo used to have very low water rates. But another thing that happens is when you treat organic pollutants like feces with chlorine, you get a byproduct of trihalomethanes. And to reduce those adds to the treatment costs. In this case, we spent $50 million for a plant to put ozone, for a facility to put ozone into the treated water to reduce the trihalomethanes and to help knock down the microcystin. So my guess would be, if I had to guess, I'd say that Toledo is probably never going to have to shut down the water plant again. I mean, who knows how bad the microcystin could get under the right conditions, but given all the money that's been put into the treatment plant, they probably won't have to shut it down again. But you can see here how crazy it is to keep taking care of things on the back end. But let's follow the manure. This is a aerial view, a satellite view of one of these factory farms in quotes. This is a Bridgewater Dairy in Williams County. 3,900 cows, and it generates as much waste every year, or more actually, than the towns of Perrysburg, Sylvania, Maumee, Defiance, and Fremont combined from this one facility. And those arrows are pointing to the lagoons where the waste is stored before it's pumped out into the fields. And that white oval on the right towards the bottom, we'll look at those little boxes down there more closely. That is a veal operation where they put male calves that obviously don't give milk, and most of the male calves either get sent to veal, some of them get sent to get fattened up for belts and shoes, and some of them just get a bullet in the back of the head and dumped in the animal composting facility that each one of these things has to have. So the male calves are of not a whole lot of value. Here's a picture of a tanker out in the field spreading the manure. It goes from those lagoons to a tanker or some other device for spreading the manure out there, and it gets applied over and over and over to these fields. Next one. Goes through the soil to the underground drainage or surface, or runs off the surface. And about, as best we can tell, about 50-50 from surface runoff and the underground drainage, which is only a big problem here in this part of the country. And it goes into streams that feed Lake Erie, and that's not root beer in that stream. And it winds up going into Lake Erie, and here's the shot from a satellite, the next one, of our dear lake. And it used to just frost me when we were in the early days of making our presentations, when some Chamber of Commerce type would say, "Oh, you're going to give us a black eye." I said, wait a minute, here, you can see this from outer space, okay? This is no secret. We can refuse to talk about it or refuse to do anything about it, but it's not like, it's not there. So next one. This is where it gets into the interesting part, I think. What we're doing now doesn't work. There's what are called best management practices that the program you may have heard of, H2 Ohio, the last 2 or 3 years has become a bit of a big deal with state government. They put millions, tens of millions of dollars into paying farmers to do such things as buffer strips. That's the picture on the left. Grassed waterways is on the right, and a grassed waterway is basically a section of farm field that when it rains, water kind of collects there and runs off. It's not really a ditch, but that's what it is. And paid for cover crops for doing no-till farming. And the interesting thing is, as our group has been saying over and over again, is that these best management practices, as they're called, do nothing to control the dissolved phosphorus. And in fact, according to the studies that we've seen, they make it worse. There's actually more dissolved phosphorus. Don't ask me why that would be, but that's what the studies are finding, is that when you use buffer strips, grassed waterways, cover crops, and no-till, you wind up with more dissolved phosphorus. And think about phosphorus as sugar. If you had a tablespoon of sugar and you dissolved it in a glass of water, it's dissolved, and that sugar is going to go everywhere that water goes. And that's what happens with dissolved phosphorus. And up until not many years ago at all, since we've got into this 5 years ago, finally the authorities are publicly saying that the way they used to measure the phosphorus in the lake was insufficient, because they measured total phosphorus, which includes particulate phosphorus, and that's not the problem. It's the dissolved phosphorus. And when you measure what happens with dissolved phosphorus with these best management practices, it's day and night difference between that and the particulate phosphorus. So these things, the buffer strips and so forth, were proposed a long time ago, and they do a decent job of keeping the topsoil from going into the creeks and the nitrogen, but they do not help when it comes to dissolved phosphorus. So anyway, next one. And here's proof of the fact that these things don't work. This chart is again from the Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Lab. It starts in '74 and it goes to 2011, and it has not changed much since 2011. And what we're seeing is the dissolved phosphorus going into the western basin of Lake Erie. This is a dissolved reactive phosphorus starting in '74, back when the Clean Water Act hadn't really started working yet. Sewage treatment plants were terrible. The phosphorus was still in the detergent. And through the years, up until the mid 90s, you can see where that has fallen. And guess what happens in the mid 90s? These factory farm operations start coming into our watershed, and you can see what that has done to the dissolved phosphorus level. So, I mean, we're not just out there hollering that this doesn't work. This is pretty clear, I think. Next one. And I put this in here just to show for sure, for people hopefully will stick in their heads, that when you start hearing the Farm Bureau and other interest groups saying, well, it's not the farmers, it's the cities and their sewage treatment plants. And then, several months ago, we had the city of Maumee busted for letting millions of gallons of sewage go through its sewage treatment plant without being treated, which, I mean, they deserve to get busted for it. And the water and sewer ratepayers in Maumee are going to pay a lot of money to get that fixed. But the point is, as you saw on an earlier slide, that 89% of what's going into Western Lake Erie, it comes from agriculture, and that's from the Ohio EPA. This slide shows what Toledo's sewage treatment plant does. And the red lines are the phosphorus that's coming into the plant, and the blue lines, much shorter, is the phosphorus that leaves the plant. So you can see that trend line has gone down. And in fact, if you look at 2018, and that blue line is below the next horizontal line, and that means that less than half of the phosphorus allowed by the US EPA's permit is leaving the sewage treatment plant in Toledo. And that doesn't mean there isn't some going in there, but it's way less even than the EPA's permit allows. So next one. So here's some recommendations that we have. Recognize that nature has rights. We endorsed and supported with people and money the Lake Erie Bill of Rights that was unfortunately declared unconstitutional. The factory farm industry and other allies, the Pork Council and the building trades and, you know, on and on, Chamber of Commerce, were ready the day after Toledoans passed the Lake Erie Bill of Rights by 60 to 40%. Within 24 hours of that, they were in federal court with a lawsuit with some shill farmer saying that he was going to be harmed by this thing and hadn't even gone into effect yet, and it worked its way through the courts and was declared unconstitutional. So we also spent 2 or 3 years when we first got going trying to get Lake Erie declared impaired under the Clean Water Act. And at the time, that was a big deal to get the EPA to say, okay, this is impaired, because when a body of water is declared impaired, they're supposed to begin a process under the Clean Water Act to determine the sources and amounts, which requires a lot of stream sampling. You have to come up with an enforceable action plan based on what are called total maximum daily loads. And this action plan has got mandatory goals that are legally enforceable, and there's accountability for meeting those goals. And that's what we had to go into federal court to finally get the EPA to say, okay, it's impaired and we're going to do these TMDLs. So we're looking for remediation that works, not the H2 Ohio programs. And we have come out with a position that we should get rid of these facilities altogether. Next one. And this is a political fight. It's probably not news to any of you in this audience, but a lot of times people don't realize how political these things are. And I'll use the example of recently retired, less than 2 years ago, the deputy chief of the Ohio EPA worked for 19 years as a lobbyist for the Farm Bureau before he got hired by the Ohio EPA. And he came out publicly and said that TMDLs aren't needed, that we can keep doing voluntary measures. This is a political fight because these H2 Ohio practices that are getting tens of millions of dollars is good money after bad. We're in this presentation, we're showing that these management practices do not work on the problems that are causing these algal blooms.
Mark, what are TMDLs?
Total maximum daily load.
Oh.
That's a term under the Clean Water Act that is, you want to go back to the previous slide? Yeah, okay. To declare the Western Basin impaired is supposed to begin a process
I
under the
see.
Water Act that includes an enforceable action plan based on
I see.
and those things are called total maximum daily loads. How much
Thank you.
can go into the lake before it turns toxic. So anyway, legislature wants to look like they're doing something, so they pass a lot of money for these practices that don't work. This next one, the Western Lake Erie Basin CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations, got 17 million in public support just between 2008 and 2015. And one of the things that I'm hoping our group can do is to update that figure. We need that money shifted to support sustainable farming. And the big political decision as far as who's going to clean up Lake Erie, it comes down to, is it going to be farmers who've already reduced their commercial fertilizer usage, or water and sewer ratepayers who've already paid a lot of money, or where most of this is coming from, which is the factory farm corporations. And the next one. But we're confident that we can do this because we did it before. And this talks a little bit about the history and the power of democracy can save the lake again, which of course assumes an active and engaged public, but it can be done. Next one. And here's some things, tell people about this, obviously, have us do this presentation, and thank you again for the invitation to do it for you. Get local governments involved. We got the city of Toledo to pass a resolution to say we ought to ban factory farms. And we're not going away till the lake is healthy. This is a couple of shots of things that we do, picketing officials. And the picture on the bottom left, we got dressed up for a neighborhood parade like animals on a factory farm. That's my wife in the cow costume there. And we went through the parade, and it gave a graphic description of what it was like to be in that situation. Next slide. And Margaret Mead's quote, just a wonderful quote. And as Oliver Hazard Perry might have said, and instead of "don't give up the ship," we took that flag and changed it to "don't give up the lake." So that's the end of the presentation, and there is a blank slide next. And then after that blank slide, there's a few other slides for discussion. But if you would, Mark, if you would jump up next to the slide, I hope it's the next one. Yeah. When I said there was a veal operation, that was in that satellite view of the farm. All your little boxes, tiny little dots where that was, but this is what they look like up close. And I mentioned that's, when you're a male calf on a dairy CAFO, your life isn't worth much. So these guys are still alive because they're turning them into veal, if you want to call that living. And there's some other shots there too of what stuff looks like inside some of these CAFOs. I went through thousands of pictures of animals in these facilities to try to come up with some that would work for our billboards. So I've seen a lot of these. I'll just go through the next one here just rapidly. Oh, here's us when we kicked off the billboard campaign. That's what one of the billboards looked like. And then the next one on the right there is the Solheim Golf Classic. We were outside the Inverness Golf Club. And then a couple of shots of our airplane flying over. And I don't know what the next one is, but why don't you just take a look at that? Never mind, we won't get into the Chesapeake Bay thing unless somebody has a question about it. So, okay, that's it. Thank you.
So we could open it up for some questions or comments from our participants. Thank you so much, Mike. There's so much information there. It sounds like we really need to be watching this issue.
And that slideshow is available. You can download it. It's on the homepage of our website, which is lakeerieadvocates.org. And you'll see the icon for the third battle for Lake Erie, a little thing that started the slideshow. And you click on that icon and you can download exactly what we saw today.
Wow. Thank you, Mike. That's some pretty astonishing and sobering facts.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, we tiled our farmland too. I have that same memory of putting those clay tile in the.
Where'd you grow up?
In the ground, Blissfield, Michigan.
I grew up in Berkeley, Ohio.
Oh, really?
I see Clemence has a comment or question. Go ahead, Clemence.
I live on the opposite end of Lake Erie than Mike does. I live in Pennsylvania, and actually 2 of the streams that run through my property go into Conneaut Creek, which goes directly into the eastern part of Lake Erie. And I'm just wondering, is it the same thing in our area of Pennsylvania, or is it more the orchards and the other types of farms that we have in the eastern part of the lake? Or are you more concentrated on just the western part of Lake Erie?
Well, thank you, Clemence, for mentioning that, because I said earlier I wanted to give a little broader geographical look at this. Obviously, what I was talking about here in the slideshow pertains to the western basin of Lake Erie, and the western basin watershed is 8,000 square miles. It's very big. It extends into southeastern Michigan and northeast Indiana, and it's got all those various facilities on it that we talked about. However, Northeast Ohio and Pennsylvania, much less of the land is in agriculture just because of the topography and whatever. And plus, like you're saying, with orchards and vineyards, that's a whole different kind of agriculture. So there may be some of these factory farms around. You'd have to look and see. But I did want to mention that regardless of what might be coming down the Conneaut River, that what's happening in Western Lake Erie affects all of Lake Erie, because what happens, in fact, it's starting to happen right now, this time of year when the weather cools off, is this cyanobacteria that we call algae. This cyanobacteria starts to die off. And when anything like that dies in huge numbers, it decomposes, and that sucks the dissolved oxygen out of the water. That process consumes oxygen. And what happens is there are huge dead zones where there's not enough dissolved oxygen in the water to support life. And those dead zones then go from the Western Basin all through the lake and eventually over Niagara Falls. So it does, what's happening here does affect the rest of the lake. And I'm not up on what the dead zone impact is for the towns east of here to get their drinking water out of the lake, but that's something you could take a look at locally and find out what, because I'm sure that Cleveland and Sandusky and Conneaut and so forth, if they get their water out of the lake, they're aware of these dead zones and can tell you what they're concerned about.
I see Richard posted a comment about asking about Great Lake wide environmental organizations. Are there any that are covering the whole group? He says some of us in Michigan are watching the Lake Superior protection movement in particular.
There are some. There's a Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I'm not sure what. The Environmental Law and Policy Center is a public interest law firm out of Chicago that is representing our group in the federal lawsuit to try to get the EPA to uphold the Clean Water Act. As far as like grassroots environmental groups like ours, there's the Ohio Community Rights Network that was involved with helping pass the Lake Erie Bill of Rights a couple of years ago. And that's a network of groups that are concerned about primarily environmental issues throughout the entire Lake Erie area. And, you know, let me just tell you, some of the larger groups, you know, whether it's a Sierra Club or the Alliance for the Great Lakes, or, you know, there's any number of these groups, and we've seen a lot of them set up shop in Toledo since the water crisis. The Ohio Environmental Council. You got to really look at these groups' record and look at what they do and what they spend their money on. And generally, these larger groups that got a lot of staff are really good at raising money. And they are as cautious and conservative as you can get. Every once in a while, you'll find them taking good positions, but I've seen in our experience with the Ohio Environmental Council and the Alliance for the Great Lakes, some of the other ones, you know, it's like you tell them this information, but they, you know, they keep backing the best management practices that don't work. They're up there with the governor at a news conference saying, oh, this is great, we got more money for H2 Ohio and stuff like that. So I know it's not a very good answer to your question about Great Lakes wide.
Well, yeah, this is the kind of thing that I had expected, because it's kind of in the nature of environmental action alliances at whatever level we operate. It was particularly the environmental law group based in Chicago that I had in mind, because what I know of them so far, they're very, very good and highly competent in a lot of the technical and legal issues. Mm-hmm. But another thing that this raises for us to keep thinking.
I see you, Judith, and I see you, Bob. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, okay. Another thing for that this presentation reminds me of, and I've seen a couple of other examples within yearly meeting over the last couple of years, is that a lot of our environmental action work is focused at the state level. Ohio Michigan, Western Pennsylvania a little differently. And so for us as an Earth Care network within Lake Erie Yearly Meeting, this is something we'll continue to be working on. One of the possible Earth Care programs for coming months that I have in mind has to do with the environmental action at the state legislature that we're doing within green pastures, and how useful it would be for those of you from Ohio and Pennsylvania to hear about that in any detail is something I'd like to know more about.
Thank you.
I saw Judith first, and then we'll go to Bob.
Hi, it's, can you hear me?
Yep.
Judy Greenberg. Mike, I came in kind of late on your presentation. I've seen part of it before. But I'm real interested in the bulletin boards against
Billboard?
factory farming.
The billboard?
Billboards, right. And I don't know if that's still happening. Is that a good place to put our money or not?
Well, we concluded that campaign the end of September. It ran for almost 3 months. And we don't have plans to start it again, but you know, we could at some other point. We've got all the designs and everything, and we know how to deal with the companies now that we didn't know how to do before. So, and we have a banner with an airplane banner that says Lake Erie is not a toilet, ban factory farms, that we flew over downtown. And that banner is in storage at the place where the plane flies out of. And for $400, we can have it flown for 2 hours anywhere we want. So that's, you know, one of the other things that got developed for that campaign that's still available.
So if we
Go
just
ahead, Bob.
contribute to your group, if we just donate to the group, somebody will make these good decisions about factory farms, I hope, right?
Well, your money will be put to good work. I can tell you that. We spent
Okay.
a lot of money on these billboards. It was the most money we spent more money on that billboard campaign than we spent in the other 4 years we've been together. So we don't throw a lot of money around.
Okay,
Mike,
thank you.
I think,
Go ahead,
Mike,
Bob.
can I just finish this, Bill?
Yeah.
Mike hasn't explained that those are not paper billboards. Those are the electronic kind. So we're paying for the blips of 30 seconds or whatever they are to keep flipping over the whole time.
Most of them are. We did have some what they call stationary or static boards. One of the two in Cleveland was static board, and the two in Columbus downtown were static boards. But you're right, most of them were electronic ones.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I'm in Central Ohio, so we hear a lot about fracking. And this is helpful to me to hear what's happening in Northwestern Ohio and Lake Erie. I'm thinking about the Maumee River, and just for example, factory farms in Henry County and the Maumee River from Napoleon all the way to Maumee or Toledo or whatever being impacted. Is there a difference in impact between the river and the lake? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. We're mostly focused on the lake because that's what most people are focused on, because that's where our drinking water comes from. Now, if you're talking about places upriver like Napoleon and other places upriver, they do get their drinking water. Defiance, they get their drinking water from reservoirs and from the river. And it's one system. It's one hydrologic system, right? So it affects the whole system in different ways. Sometimes what we call algal blooms, which, you know, we said in the presentation are really cyanobacteria masses. Sometimes those will start popping up all over the river. And they're in inland lakes all over the place in Ohio and all over the world. And the problem's getting worse with climate warming. But our focus is on the lake, just because it's kind of where, you know, excuse my French, but as we all know, shit rolls downhill, and that's where it ends up. I wanted to point out something Richard was saying about the state level activity. You know, this work's important on many, many levels. But I do want to point out, I mentioned briefly the Ohio Community Rights Network, and that is the group that helped get the Lake Erie Bill of Rights passed. And that is a fundamentally different way of looking at environmental problems and looking at nature. I mean, they're talking about basic inalienable rights for nature. For example, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights said Lake Erie should have every right that human beings have. And if we think about it, as you probably know, corporations have all the constitutional rights of people, but nature doesn't. And that's what the Ohio Community Rights Network is really pushing. And I would urge anybody who's, particularly if you're not in the Toledo area here, if you're looking for partnerships or people of like mind, check out the Ohio Community Rights Network. And they do their work out of that context. My group, our group here is supportive of that. Like I mentioned, we supported the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, but we're also, tied up in the lawsuit to get the Clean Water Act enforced and things like that. And that's not something the rights of nature folks think is worth putting a lot of energy into.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm somewhat involved with the Ohio Community Rights Network, and one of the challenges that they're facing is that often a local municipality passes a law prohibiting something like polluting, and then the state says, oh no, you can't do that because you don't have the local control that the state can control. Yep. It's sort of a polity issue that I've become aware of in the last several years, more on fracking because of where I live, but I thought would be relevant to mention that.
Yeah, it certainly is. And that's, and if you look at the history of the environmental movement, I've been involved in the environmental movement for 40 years. I was involved with the anti-nuclear power movement way back. And when you look at the history of that movement, it's been, up until very recently, it's been engaged via the regulatory system, the Clean Water Act, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission Act, the Clean Air Act, so forth. And those regulations, even though, for example, when the Clean Water Act was passed, I think it did some good things for a few years, and it helped get Lake Erie off the sick bed. But over the years, the funding's been cut, the industries have had more influence, and the whole regulatory framework is fraught with obstacles that are put there on purpose to keep the status quo going. And the good thing about the Ohio Community Rights Network and the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and the work that they're doing is that they're saying we got to look at nature not as property. We got to look at it as having inalienable rights and work from there. And it's, like I said, it's a complete paradigm change. And hopefully that's where the environmental movement is going to be going more and more.
Go ahead, Joanne.
Well, just to say that coincides with another thing Red Cedar's working on in a different part of our social justice agenda, which is rebuilding right relationship with Indigenous people. And when you listen to them say, what would be the best thing we can do to repair the damage of cultural genocide and land theft, they say, change your mindset from consumer dominating, sense that our economies are built on nature as a raw material, and rebuild reciprocal relationships with nature. Absolutely. So two, I don't know, want to say birds with one stone, but they coincide here.
Yeah.
Interception.
I see Ken has posted a bit ago now in the chat. He's wondering how much of a contributor to the problem are non-CAFO farms, such as runoff of fertilizer and herbicides.
It's difficult to say, and actually at this point nobody can tell you for sure, in large part because we have not done a total maximum daily load study that is required by the Clean Water Act. As I mentioned, our group represented by the Environmental Law and Policy Center out of Chicago has been in federal court for 4.5 years trying to get the Clean Water Act enforced. And at some point, we think that's going to happen. And when that total maximum daily load is done by the Ohio EPA, who we don't have a whole lot of faith in, but when that's done, theoretically, one of the products of that studying is going to be the sources and the amounts of, in this case, excess nutrients. And that will tell us a lot more exactly than we know now where it's coming from. Because, for example, I mentioned the Ohio EPA has said 89% of the excess nutrients going into Western Lake Erie come from agriculture. Now, what that split is from row crop farmers with, putting fertilizer and manure on their soybeans and corn, and how much is from commercial fertilizer, nobody knows. We think at least half of it is coming from these factory farms, which of course the Farm Bureau says, oh no, it's only 8% or something, but nobody can tell you for sure. I think our estimates are probably closer to reality, but I can't tell you that for sure.
I wondered, Mike, you showed a trend in the increase in the number of these factory farms. Is the no meat, like alternative meat burger movement going to push that trend back down? Are we going to see less factory farming? My second question is there other ways to use the shit that comes out of those places for like fuel or other solutions that might have less impact on drinking water?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's other ways to use the manure. But let me tell you, dealing with that point first that you raised, as was it Joanne who grew up in Blissfield knows, and anybody who grew up in a rural area a generation or two ago can tell you that when farmers had livestock in those days, and there were thousands more farmers on the land in those days, that livestock farmers, and I used to do this as a kid, you'd go with a pitchfork and you'd clean out the stalls for the pigs and the cows and throw it into a manure wagon, and they would take that out into the field and it would be spread by this manure wagon, and most of it was straw and there was a lot of urine and feces in it, but it was spread out. The number of animals on any given location was a hundredth, and not even a thousandth of what we're talking about with these factory operations. And it was not liquid manure. That's another key thing. It was in a semi-dry solid state, and it would be spread out on the fields. And it is great fertilizer. What's happening now is these industrial operations can't deal with it that way. There's so much of it that they've got to turn it into a liquid, put it in these manure holding ponds that hold 1 million or more gallons of this stuff, and then a couple times a year in between the crops, get it pumped out onto the land. And they don't want to truck it any further than they have to because that gets expensive. And so they apply it and reapply it over and over and over again. Now, the commercial fertilizer, the farmers that are out there with the big tanks in the spring putting the anhydrous ammonia and whatever out there, they know what their soil needs. They've done the soil tests. They don't want to put any more of that stuff on than they have to because it's expensive. The manure operations, that is a waste product. It's good fertilizer, but it's a waste product they've got to get rid of, and they can't get rid of it fast enough. So they apply it as close by as they can so they don't have to truck it. They put it on as much as they can get away with. And we've got such lax enforcement that, it's liquid, goes down through the soil into the subsurface drains, and it's just untenable. It is completely unsustainable if we care to have a lake anymore. And your other question was, what else could we do with that? There's an effort on the part of Farm Bureau types and CAFO operators for methane digesters. That's supposed to be one of the technical fixes for this industry. And we found that these things are so expensive and so difficult to keep operating that they're, in practical terms, not practical. However, this industry has been really good at getting public subsidies for just about everything they do. So one of the things that we try to do is get the word out that these methane digesters are another scam. And yeah, these facilities produce methane, and it would be nice if the methane was used for something, but it's not going to take care of the phosphorus. I mean, you're going to have as much phosphorus left over as you had before. You're going to have as much manure as you had before. So, you know, our bottom line is there's no fixing this industry. There's no fixing it. It needs to be banned.
What do you think about the alternative meat trend? Is that going to take hold?
I don't know. I don't know. And I don't know how great that is. I mean, if you look at all of the inputs to make artificial meat, and I'm not an expert on that, but usually when these kinds of things come along, when you really look into them, it's not all it appeared to be at first. You know, maybe in the long run that is better than eating regular meat. We go to the farmer's market and get our eggs and our milk from places that farm sustainably. You know, and a lot of this is going to come down to consumers. However, our group is focused mainly on the public policy aspects of this. It would be great to have consumers more aware and eating less meat and so forth, and that would make a big difference if enough people did it. But there's public policy that's driving this. There's these huge subsidies and this whole way of thinking and doing business that says that this is okay. And, you know, maybe through the education that groups like ours are doing, people will decide it's a good idea not to eat as much meat, and that would be a good thing. But, you know, I'm not going to hold my breath for a consumer boycott of meat to solve this problem.
We've reached the top of the hour. Maybe it's time to wrap up. Do you want to make any last comments, Mike? Anything we should take away? I see some applause.
Well, we've covered a whole lot. I don't know if people have any comments or any other discussion. I'd be happy to hear.
Mary?
Well, one of the things I wanted to bring in and to go back to Clemence's question about the other part of the lake where she is, if you look at, and Mike, I know you were there also, the video called Toxic Puzzle, one of the scientists studying ALS and Alzheimer's diseases and other degenerative diseases did do testing all along the strip of Lake Erie from Conneaut into northeast into Pennsylvania. And there's a much higher percentage of cases of ALS there than elsewhere. And he's also done that in New Hampshire, where the lakes run north and south. And as a result of finding this out, he's done studies about the fact that this travels airborne. When these bacteria release the microcystins, they're also airborne. And so if you're downwind of what's coming off of that algae bloom, it's not good business for you. And that's really where Clemence lives, that part of where the wind blows.
Yep. And my wife and I have been living right on the edge of Lake Erie. If I turn my camera around, you can see the lake from here. And we always love when we get a lake breeze in the summertime, and I just have to kind of forget about everything that Mary just said.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Thank you so much, Mike, for your very informative presentation. We appreciate your good work.
Glad to be with you.